Okay, so Kurt's been a pioneer in collecting the shortleaf pines for what, something like 8, 9, 10 years, something like that?
I started back in 2019 is when I first started collecting them.
Okay, so maybe only 5 years, but he's done really great things with the shortleaf pines in just a few short years, and so he's going to tell us more about them and how to take care of them and answer lots of questions and all that good stuff. So.
Hi, so my name is Kurt Dillow. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
All the way to the back? Okay. So I guess a quick background on me. I've been doing bonsai for about 20 years. I got the bug back in college. I started mostly with desert trees, exotics, kind of odd things. My other big passion, I brought it to the, what was it, your guys' big convention earlier?
Yeah.
Yep, so I brought a big Bursera. So those were my original first things, and my wife and I have been rock climbers since about 2012. And every time I was out on climbing trips, especially in Arkansas in the sandstone, I kept seeing these kind of wild looking, twisted up pines, but I had never messed with traditional stuff at that point. And at a certain point I was listening to a podcast from Bjorn interviewing the backcountry bonsai guys. And I was just like, I have access to cool trees, I have the skill set, I've been raising trees for a while, I'll give it a spin. My first collecting trip is when I found that one. And so I was like, okay, there's some kind of money out here in the woods, and I don't mean for like making money, but like just there's some really interesting stuff. And what I discovered as I did more research on the species of shortleaf pine is that they're a very common agricultural product for money. You know, it's like it's a timber product. But apparently when you get into the mountains or in the especially heavy sandstone areas, they take on very different forms. They get very twisted. It's a very rugged environment. They grow a lot like what you would see out west, up in the mountains, where they're growing in rock crack seams, things like that. The root balls are small. It's a completely different extraction method. It's more like what the Western style is than out here. There are no shovels for where I collect. I'm usually 40 feet off the 40 feet to 90 feet off the deck, hanging on a rope, so I'm not messing with a bunch of stuff. And most of my stuff is tethered to me, you know, off of anchoring and lanyards and stuff like that. So it's a little different. But so that was kind of how I got into shortleaf. So in 2019, I took the jump, went out, gave it a try, collected 2 trees. Both are still alive. The other one is just at home. I hadn't had time to wire it yet, so it's a little unkempt. But figured I'd show you what these kind of general versions were. There's a lot of different sizes that I can find, but I typically try to get ones that fit in the back of a Subaru Forester, and that seems to work pretty well. And people also seem to like that size too, because it also fits in their cars. I can collect some bigger ones, but I mean, I talked to Bjorn about it, and he's like, just trying to get something that requires a forklift there's like 10 people on Earth that are actually going to deal with that. It is a new species to our hobby, in terms of we're still learning a lot about them in their behavior sets. I guess to start kind of as a general, like, let's see, we'll say the general approach, I gave them, your club leaders, a PDF that you can take home as the lecture notes of this. And kind of, I wanted to start with what the general approach is. So I wanted to look for some type of analog that you've all been dealing with. And so I thought, I talked to Bjorn, I talked to Kayak, because they spent a lot of time in Japan dealing with these species in their native environment. And they both kind of agreed that the Japanese red pine is probably the closest analog that they dealt with in terms of its aesthetic and look and feel and how it handles and like the foliar mass, everything. But what's unique about it is it's more vigorous than the Japanese black pine. One of the trees I have at home, I threw a video of it on my Instagram. It threw out 5, I collected it, what was it? The 3rd weekend in February in 2024. And by August, it had 5 flushes. It had just flush, like off the end. And so when they're happy, they're exceptionally vigorous. This produces some really cool opportunities and also some headaches if you're trying to keep the thing stunted back and under control, because as soon as they get a favorable environment, they take off. I guess within that vein, where they get this from is that they have a unique morphology. They're the member of the southern yellow pines, which is just a term that they apply to lumber, like agricultural lumber. That includes like the loblolly, the slash pine, longleaf pine, and one other. And they're distributed. They have the largest distribution in the southern United States. They cover 22 states. They cover like, I think, zone 6A down to like 8B. No, it's like 6B down to 8A. So there's a pretty significant distribution on where they can be found. They're in mixed stands all over the place. And because of that, they have a lot of adaptability. They can tolerate pretty cool temperatures. They can tolerate pretty warm. As soon as you get them in containerized environments, that changes like any tree. But how they developed that makes them unique to the other members of those pines is that they have what they call a basal crook. And it's a little weird to see, and I'll show you photos later on it. But you see how this thing has like a big hump and then it turns in here? That is actually how almost all of them, when you dig a seedling up, they'll have this weird little like S-curve. That basal crook holds a ton of buds in it. And the purpose is where they normally are out west, on the western end of their range, fires happen all the time. Cooks them down to stump, it kills all the loblollies, oaks, everything gets burned down. The loblollies do not come back, neither do any of the other relatives within the family group. But these guys explode from that burn. When that happens, they quickly become the dominant overstory plant. They are the canopy plant, and that's just kind of their niche, how they developed. Because of that, it gave it a really cool growth characteristic that it tolerates our tornadoes, our ice storms, our crazy weather where half the tree dies off. It is capable, I mean, on this one, I had to cut a branch that emerged right out of the back within the first year I owned it. It just shot a branch out of plated bark. And every time I'm out in the woods, I'll see one that's 36 to 40 inches in diameter, these huge plates that are like this big, and at the bottom, like right at the ground, you'll see little guys just coming right up out of it. And so, yes, sir.
Yeah, I've seen where they've been burnt and they're all just coming straight out of the roots from the ground.
Yeah.
And are you saying that that is a characteristic of that area right near the ground?
Well,
it does not continue up the trunk?
So, no, it does continue up the trunk, but in the event it burns all the way to the ground. So the idea was that how they're hypothesizing is that when it grows up, it runs parallel to the soil line and then comes back up. So you get this kind of funky little turn. And all of those are sitting there, so when the ground gets cooked down and then the erosion happens from the rain where there's nothing there, that exposes that bit of crook to sunlight, and then the buds activate.
But is there a point on the trunk where that stops being
Nope,
the case?
like basically just every node after that. It seems like I've kind of noticed that if, even on these older ones, as soon as the bark starts to break open, and then you see that kind of orange cambial scarring tissue forming, if that gets enough light, that will actually produce an adventitious bud if there's enough damage up top. So as long as the tree is in good health, the rootstock solid, if something major happens, because over Doug Phillips, he's a member of our club and he was a big collector out west for years. We were over on his property. He has a ton of shortleaf pine on it, and he had one that got hammered in a windstorm. And I mean, this was a 90-foot tree, topped 3 of them, and then like that next spring, it was just exploding out from all over the place, even down to the base. So I've been trying to monitor how they're behaving, because like there's still not a lot of great documentation on it, and even on some of the really good Forestry Service ones, a lot of it's very anecdotal. Guys are like, we have done no test experiments. The closest they've done an experiment to that basal crook thing is that they hybridized with loblollies, slash, and several others, and what they found was that they're losing a lot of their forest space because the loblolly has become preferred for lumber cultivation because it grows faster, but it produces a softer, kind of less good wood. So what they've been doing is they've been losing a lot of their territory to basically harvesting and for the function of agricultural lumber. But when they were reintroducing shortleafs, they started hybridizing a lot. And they were noticing up to 50% of the shortleafs they were finding were actually 50% loblolly, 50% shortleaf. And what they did, they were like, well, maybe they can survive fire. So they did this test experiment where they'd plant 3 of them. They'd have a full shortleaf, a loblolly, and then a hybrid. They'd burn the whole stand, and they had hundreds of these seedlings for the experiment. 50% of the shortleaves pop back, about 5 to 10% of the hybrids come back, and none of the loblollies come back. And so as we've been reducing, now they're starting in Arkansas especially, they do a lot of controlled burns to keep this going. But in the areas where they quit doing that, you are noticing that loblolly is way overtaking the shortleaves because that natural mechanism to normally knock the other guys down is not happening. And so they are actually hybridizing more and more and more to the point where there's less of them. Now, this is typically in the Piedmont and getting out west when you get into like Georgia and more of the deep south where the traditional southern yellow pine agriculture is happening. Over here in the Ozarks and in the plateau and our mountains, I was talking to the forestry guys, it's actually considered kind of like the Mecca because we're one of the only places that's basically an original, in some spots near arboreal version of what these forests used to look like, where it's almost 100% shortleaf with oak understory and very little scrub. that is naturally what they used to look like. They even did pollen counts, or they were showing like pollen collection data where their range used to be all the way up to Michigan. So as things shift and other things move in, they have moved across, but they're still pretty interesting. So that's what gives it its unique characteristic. Like that was collected in 2019. I'll show you a before photo in a minute, but it had, very little foliar mass. And in that short period of time, we've been pushing it out pretty quick, which is quite rapid for most trees. So that would say that, when you approach them, look at them as like aesthetically, it is a Japanese red pine. In terms of vigor, it's going to lean, it's more like a Japanese black pine on steroids, but it has this kind of interesting characteristic because its range is so huge. It tolerates more heat, more dry heat than like actually a Japanese black pine or a red pine, but it can tolerate temps nearly as cold or as cold as a red pine. So you kind of have this nice little thing, but that's Missouri in a nutshell. We just have crazy weather. And so it would make sense that the only native pine here can tolerate that range. So I've been encouraging people, if you've been struggling with certain pines, like this may be a nice analog. I know both Bjorn was buying quite a few of them from me, and Kaya seems very interested in them if he comes back stateside, and it's because they want something that has that look, feel, and aesthetic, but like tolerates our region a little bit better. And I'm assuming down the road there could be some neat grafting concepts and things like that, but we can get the needles about this short. I've collected some that had needles like this big that were out in the wild. Of course, as soon as you start feeding them, they blow up like crazy, and then you gotta do all the work to pull them back. But so that would be how I'd say, when you approach them, frame your brain around them as that's kind of generally what they are. And all of the other practices usually follow suit. Like your repotting, your potting medium, you guys that had asked about soil composition in the wild, and again, this will be in the PDF, but in the wild, they do, at least in my experience where I was collecting, it's a sandy loam duff. So you're going to find it's nothing but the pine needles that drop down from that tree, a little bit of erosion that comes down, so you'll have some actual normal humic stuff, and then a lot of it is the natural breakdown of the sandstone, so you just have lots of sand embedded in it. When you pick it up, it's kind of interesting. The stuff, when it dries out, it basically feels like nothing. It's almost like styrofoam. It's so light. And then as soon as it gets wet, it's really quite interesting. It's like this kind of nice, soft, happy sponge. And so a lot of times when I actually collect when it either rained the day before or when it's raining that day, slightly. And it's because they pop right out of the rock vein much easier because they kind of delaminate from the rock when they're dry. Because they're kind of half anchoring into the rock. They have a tendency you could tear fine roots. This allows a lot more easier relieving them from the rock. So usually they're going to have a more acidic soil, on the more acidic side because it's pine needles and a lot of that decomposition. So you're going to have a lot of acidic humic activity going on. Of course, typically you imagine them, they're up on a hill, they're in this kind of dry sandy condition. They prefer it on the drier side, but I've seen them tolerate a lot of water. So when they're actively growing, especially because they're so vigorous, if they start exploding on you, they're going to dry your pot out like you would not believe. They'll just suck water down like crazy. So there's this kind of funky little interplay you're going to have of where they want to do that full dry out, but they're going to be probably needing more frequent water application than you would experience with a red pine. I guess the other big thing was, typical to pines, they're going to want good drainage. And your typical Aoki blend or any of the soil mixes, like the 3-part mixes that you use with a grain size anywhere between 2 and 5 millimeter works really well. Again, you can treat the same scaling the bigger a pine you have, the bigger the grain size you're going to use. So just use that exact same scaling methodology that we use with all the other pines and conifers. A standard conifer mix, from what we've experienced, just works really well. There's no special magic mix that really it needs to be applied to them, at least in our practice. And then the other thing that I've noticed, and this seems to be true, they're definitely not big fans of calcium, which here in Missouri I know we're oh boo, that's all of our water. But they do seem to not enjoy excessive amounts of calcium buildup. That is a thing. So how I usually try to offset that is you can either treat your water slightly, or I fertilize a lot with fish emulsion and liquid kelp and stuff like that, and I'll sometimes add a little bit of the I forgot what that additive is that you use, that it's just a standard what you use in blueberry mix for acidifiers. I'll throw a little bit of that in every so often just to kind of push the calcium back out of the soil column, and that seems to work pretty well as a general rule. So that would be soil. So we've already covered watering. I think that seems pretty straightforward. Let's see what else. Cold tolerance, we kind of touched on that. So yeah, their zone is between like 6A and 8B, which means they can technically tolerate, about -10 to -23 Fahrenheit. And I have seen them. This guy, I had it out in a box one season. It was still while it was in a bigger box. And it got down to -20. And all it did was kind of like, it was particularly windy. It desiccated the tips on the needles, but it just blew out like crazy the following spring. So it did not harm the plant negatively. Of course, obviously, the smaller the container, the newer the collection, the more delicate the roots are. Use all the same things you're being taught by these guys about protecting your plants. That doesn't give you a pass to just be like, yeah, -80, figure out. No. But the nice thing is, if there's a sudden cold snap, you're not losing this tree. They're much hardier than those. What I typically do when they're first collected, I like to collect mine later in the season, usually like second week of February through 4th week of March. I will go collect, because if you're a little clever about where you look for your trees, like if one is in a north-facing rock covers it a lot, or it's in understory, it does not wake up as fast as the ones that are in full sun. So you can actually get over and time how you want to collect based on that. I always go out in advance of a collection, usually 3 times. I mark all the trees I want with geopins, and I usually use the Onyx app, and I mark where everything is so I know where my property lines are, I know who to talk to, all the permissions. But that way I also photo document them to look at health, and when I come back, if it looks like anything's changed between that photo and then, I go, looks like the health might be declining, it's not waking up appropriately, I go, that's a no-go. I also look at it because I have to do a lot of climbing to get there, and I need to accommodate my rigging and everything else. I need to plan in advance of that, who's my climbing partner, ... Wear bright clothing so if I do fall, someone can find my remains, fun stuff like that. It's like there's a little bit more to it than, but I typically plan in advance, so that way I know exactly how many trees I'm hauling back or what the goal is, and that also lets me know the size container. I usually investigate a little bit at that time, and then I'll usually have my containers either ready to go or the amount of pumice, stuff like that. So when I get home, I can kind of production run it, and I'm not going like, what do I do? I've only impulse purchased a couple of them in my collecting, and that one was one of them. All we saw was like the little pigtail off of a waterfall. Like it was a seasonal waterfall, and we just saw this funky little like twist. And my buddy was like, does that look interesting? I'm like, let's chuck a rope. And we dropped down, and then we found the base sticking out of the thing. And we're like, that's coming home with us. So usually that is not how it goes. Now I actually use spotting glass. So I'll usually like bring a pretty good long optic. I'll look from distance across valleys to see where things are at, decide where I'm at. I mark every time I've surveyed an area and kind of keep track of that stuff. So one, you're not just like wandering in the woods till you die of old age, but like you get this stuff figured out. And some of them, like I'll check them year to year to see if they're looking better. Like one year they might look a little anemic. I go, I'm not sure. And you'll come back, sure enough, it's dead the next year. Like it's kind of one of those. And sometimes I do what I call a rescue trees, where like this tree is clearly like a log rolled on it, smashed it, dislodged it, and it is not doing good. I will collect those and just see if I can get it to shred, because it's going to check out. So I'm like, let's give her a spin. And usually that one gets gifted to one of my club members or something. It's just more of a, nature's having a rough run on this tree, so I'll see if we can give it a chance. And if I have some spare pumice, we'll do that. I guess you guys had questions also as well on pruning, and this is kind of like all in. I feel like these are subcategories. So you got pruning, decandling, and like the back budding. Yes, sir.
I'm obviously not going to be repellent or maybe clips or anything like that.
Yeah.
So in the understory, are there interesting?
Yeah, actually, some of all my favorite literati ones that I've collected, like that one that Kaya worked on, understory. So what I found, what's interesting, at least where I was collecting it, is you'll have the big drop off, and you're like, ooh, and there's all the real kind of like fat, gnarly little twisted ones. But as soon as you come back about like 20, 30, 40 yards back from that, you get these kind of like egg rocks that have just been dumped. It's stuff that's just calved off of the top and rolled down. And then it's got a bunch of soil on top of it, but as soon as you dig down 6 inches, you're hitting another rock again. So you get these really shallow, wide root balls. And usually the big trees are starting about there, and they provide this kind of like shade over it. And then you'll have this little dude trying to sneak out to get to it. And so he has to lean out from this like little mini drop. So there's like a mini cliff for him. It's like all of, 1.5 feet for you, but he has to dive out because there's no way to send roots down. There's nothing to go back. And so it's trying to run out to get photosynthesis. And You get these cool little spindly guys, and they have trunks usually about that big around, but they're old, they're really barked up, and just because they were in kind of a garbage spot, they don't get a ton of light, so they can't take off too much. And in the understory, a lot of them get banged up. You'll notice like a lot like that one that Kai had, it had a whole dead top and then it had done another run. Being in the understory with the windstorms and tornadoes and ice storms that we have, crap like deadfalls landing on them all the time, but because they're thin and flexible, they'll snap, break over, and pop back up, and then they just start again running out to the light. So you get these really neat shapes. They're very easy to collect, in my opinion. I mean, usually I take one of those folding silky saws. I'll just kind of, I usually take my hand and kind of margin around, find where I'm clearly wide enough, and then I will just take the silky saw and just gently saw around. It cuts all the fine roots, and then you just slip your hand underneath, and the thing pops off like a pancake. And then I just take it, slip it in a bag, and then I usually use packing cellophane on one of those little hand rollers. You can pick them up at Home Depot, Lowe's, any of the U-Haul, and just buy those. And you can wrap that sucker really tight. And then what I'll do is I'll just kind of slip the top, once it's bagged in tight, I'll slip the top open and pour a little bit of water if it's dry or whatever. I've learned when I was young, or I mean when I was new to it, I would load it up with water like, we're gonna take care of this. And I'm like, and now it weighs 500 times more, and I now have to walk this thing. Because where I'm collecting at, I am usually 2 to 3 miles from my parking spot, and it's in the mountains. So you're going up steep hills and then off bad terrain, and it's all brambles. There's no trails. It sucks. So I do. When you're considering these things, like weight is a thing. The tree was just fine sitting there dry 20 minutes before. It will be fine until you get it home. Just don't when you are hauling them. I mean, things to consider just on the collecting thing. Keep them in the shade. So if you're gonna go collect more, you get it. Leave it under a big tree where you know it's not gonna get exposed to sun, and that root ball is not gonna get hit by anything. That's a good way if you're gonna go wander about or do other things for efficiency's sake. And then when you get home, do a long soak. Is typically, how. But yes, to answer your question, you can find those really nice literatis there. The heavier ones typically do not develop underneath that that much shade. They have to be out and exposed because they just seem to girth up a lot better in that environment.
So when you are getting them home, you're treating them like pines, like a collected pine,
Yes.
you're leaving a lot of the native
Yes.
soil, not like a deciduous, you're just clearing it all out.
Correct. Yeah, which is funny because I came up with deciduous, so it's like it was very strange. And I have found the more of that field soil you can keep, the better. Now what I do is I collect more than I need, and when I get home, I will actually, when I have the time and patience to sit there and look at it, because I'll also investigate, and it will never fail. You're going to find other roots from other plants getting in there, pulling all that out, and then you find out what your real root ball actually is. So that way when you go to pot it up, you don't have a bunch of stuff rotting. Like that's the other thing. You have damaged the root system, and now you're leaving other things to rot that could be carrying all sorts of really nasty pathogens that could then introduce themselves into a weakened tree. So I'll go through, kind of clear that stuff out. If I catch, again, another one of those big roping, girdling roots that goes to nowhere, but a couple fine ones on the end, I'll clip those off. And then that's usually when I make my decision on the final adjustments on the container, to the point too of placing things to block out to make the container work. I buy a lot of these plastic ones, and what I will do is I will drill them to add more holes as needed. The other nifty thing about them is you can actually, if you pre-drill them, you can actually block wood into them and pump screws into them. Or another technique, this is where I've gotten lazier as I've moved on, is I will have pumice of different diameters. So I'll have some pumice that's like that big around, and what I'll do is I'll just pack that into the corner where there's no roots, and it's just there for structure so it doesn't erode into it. And then I'll cap it with all the same stuff, but basically there's just a big dead zone that dries out, and that allows to do that. So if I'm like, man, I don't have a bit of wood laying around, I can do that. And if I get closer to the roots, but there wasn't a lot of field soil, because some of these I'll collect them and there's just literally 2 handfuls, that's it, that was in the crack. I'll keep pumice that's probably about an eighth to a 16th, and I'll keep that around the base. And then as I get out, it becomes a coarser grain, and that's to just keep a little bit more water near the core. And then as it works out, there's a little bit less, and it gets to the normal grain size that I've taught up. That's a more recent thing I've been doing the last 2 or 3 seasons, and my success rate has gone up. Again, this is still anecdotal. None of this is gospel. It's going to take years of doing this before we're all certain, but little workarounds that I've been trying to come up with.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, if you got it laying there, and you know how the core stuff, you're I usually use that as my drainage layer. Actually, a real cheap way, pick up that, especially if you want to keep the containers from weighing 1,000 pounds, they sell that really coarse perlite that they use for grow operations. Stuff that in the corner. It's great, doesn't eat up a ton of space. The only thing that sucks is it floats. So usually I will cap it with 1 inch of like a pumice to keep that from floating, because that drives me absolutely nuts. So pruning and decantling, I mean, you're going to treat these, I mean, again, this is like most pines. I mean, some people have opinions about when, but in my experience, I've kind of noticed that you can do your work in fall, like any other pine or conifer. The thing is, you are going to want to protect them. I have found that the trees seem to do a lot better if you leave more foliar mass on them across the winter. It makes them more winter hardy because they have more nutrients they can suck out of the foliar mass, dump to the roots, and hold them over. And then I'll do all my selection, needle plucking, wiring, hard cuts, bends, all that happens right around early. Like, I started a couple of them last week. So I'll do that. Again, it depends on what type. If you have the ability to protect them, like in a cold frame or greenhouse or something like that, do that work, especially the hard bends and everything. You could do those in the fall, like any other tree. If you are concerned that you don't have those facilities available to you, then you may want to wait until like mid-February. It's a really good time, and every time I've done it, they seem to pop back. And again, that's also what I've discovered with my collecting. I'll collect in November or December or January, but I have seen my collection quality rate, like the survival rate, go up a lot by just collecting in late February and early March. I don't know if it's just because that's the time they start waking up. They seem to just pop right after. Like, if I can time all the major cuts and everything right before they wake up, or the repot or everything, they just seem to explode. If there's like a lag, like a long period, especially when you're bringing them in from the wild, that seems like they can have problems, at least in my, again, anecdotal experience. But again, I've also, I had Bjorn style this one time. He did it in the fall. I protected it, and it did just fine. It didn't miss a beat. But again, I didn't let the roots freeze. I didn't let the top freeze during that time. So you have to take a little bit more care, but if you're selecting trees that are manageable in size, it's a pretty easy task. It's just, if you got a monster, it is a thing you're gonna have to make decisions about. Decandling, because I've seen you guys had asked about like decandling with like timing and frequency. So again, I had one that flushed 5 times. Bjorn had one that flushed 3 times. If they are very healthy and they've been fed a lot, especially the prior fall, and they're holding a lot of nutrients, they tend to explode. Like, they'll just go boom, boom, boom on you. And if they're getting good water, good light, and they're happy, they go gangbusters. We have been, and I say we, the few of us that have been working on them, have been laboring under the traditional idea of doing it usually in June, like early June, and then the second flush sometime around in August, and we treat that. Every time I do that, my second flush lately that happens winds up like this long by August, and so we're either going to have to switch to a three cut method, or I'm going to actually push the first one all the way into like July, like possibly like 3rd week of July, because every time I do that, these guys are still elongating all the way into like October, and so I kind of go like, November is when you can tell they're really starting to like, close shop. So again, that's kind of a test run. So it's like, do you want to treat it as a double flush, or are you going to treat it as a true multi-flush where I have to plan for 3, which means we tested one. We did the first cut. Like, that guy will have candles this long by 3rd week of April. Like, I mean, they're going. So technically, you could cut them. Another one would pop by July, and it's already going to be that long again by July, and you could cut it again and then probably have something quite small. So it's going to either be a 3 starting in April, or it's going to be a 2 starting sometime in like June or July. It's kind of where we're at. Again, this has not been settled, but everyone I've been talking to who is working with them, that's what they're running into. Again, more data, more people, more time. The Japanese have been working with black pines and red pines forever, so they have a lot more empirical data on it. So I guess to say, to be discovered.
Right.
And then back budding was the other one, and that kind of dovetails right off that. And that goes back to that basal crook conversation and their biology. They are geared towards back budding. They have your typical, apical buds that come off, and then you also get your fascicle needle buds that happen, and these do that a lot. So when you're needle plucking, sometimes leaving some of those needles on for a little bit longer, you'll get a lot more of those. And then the other one that happens are all those adventitious buds that are happening between all the plates, the cracks, and things like that. And the more they get cut back, the more they're prone to it. one of the gentlemen who's been working with him, he he killed a whole branch back. I mean, like this thing had a low branch probably like this wide, and he lobbed it right here, and we're like, this thing's dead, put a gin on it. And then the next spring, it was covered in buds right at the cut site. So like right where the collar from where the bark ended to where the gin stub comes out, it blew out new growth. So if the tree's healthy and happy, I think those could be interesting things. Like you could approach the tree differently than you would with other ones because it gives you opportunity. But it also means like if that's a spot you want to die, you may have to kind of like keep nipping at it until that finally decides this is a dead road. So again, it provides a lot of interesting opportunities. It's almost like it wants to be a deciduous, but again, it has a lot of these conifer characteristics. So that would be where I'd say back budding is as long as it's well fed, it's healthy, and you time that, they're going to pop. Yes, sir.
If you're planning on decandling multiple times, do you slow down your fertilization or you just keep it fertilizing the crap out of it?
And again, that's the other debate that we're having because it's like, do I just keep this engine? The thing I have run into is that it puts on a ton of vascular tissue as well. So it will start expanding. And you know, with like old pines, if you're not careful, they could exfoliate off their old nice bark if you're not careful because they're thickened so rapidly. So this year I'm going to be doing another experiment on how I time my fertilization. So I'm probably I'll pump it up in the spring like usual, just hammer it. And then I think I'm going to switch to a purely like fish emulsion liquid application with not even cake on top for the remainder of the year. And just do that. And then as soon as fall starts setting in, I'll ramp back up with some heavy dosing. I've even been doing a couple, like an odd experiment, and I'm sure I get poo-pooed, but like usually like just before spring kicks off, I'll do a synthetic, it will be like Miracle Grow. And early spring before they're even waking up, after I've done all my work, I'll do a dilute dump into that, just so as that guy's starting to wake up, there's something to snap into, because if we're using organics, they have to have the temperature in order to actually like break down and like have the roots have it bioavailable. But if I do that, it seems that they open up a little bit faster and start launching. So I'm doing little experiments with it. Not important, but things that can be done.
So you're talking making a tea or whatever?
No, I'm literally just taking Miracle Grow and go give it a little shot and do that. When I collect these guys from the wild, all they eat is Miracle Grow. Like that's all they get. And then I usually will hit them with a micronutrient pack. And then when their first fall hits is when I'll throw cake on. But I just hammer them with synthetics the entire time. The other thing I'm doing too is, there's kind of two reasons why I do that. They also, every time I collect these guys out of the wild, I treat them for pest and disease. They are segregated from everything else. They are treated with very powerful systemic fungicides and pesticides. And I run that cycle nonstop as they come in, because they'll come in with gall, they'll come in with like tip moths, they'll come in with all, and you don't know what is going on in that soil. And so usually also the presence of synthetics during that time, because it's salt, has a tendency of not being advantageous to some of the other pathogens that are in there. Once they stabilize, they're looking good and they're strong, then we go back to good organics, and then after that. But it seems to cause them to grow quite rapidly. They get strong, and then after that, I taper that back off.
What systemics are you using? Safari or something like that?
So I usually rotate 4 on both, and that's just to make sure I'm not building pathogenic resistance. Mm-hmm. So I'll usually go between. So we'll do Daconil, Mancozeb. What else? What's that really crazy concentrated one? Systemax, and then there's one other. Yeah, and then I use Bonsai, so I'll switch between topicals, and I'll switch between like drenches. And I do like drenches quite a bit. I'll soak the whole root ball, do that. And then with the insecticides, these guys don't really need malathion. I've only found tip moth twice on them. And if I'm treating them with synthetics, I usually find that the moth quite dead after he's tried just a little bit on one of them. They don't make it. I usually I have a topical mix that I make for spraying for insecticide, and it was something I learned from a guy who is a house pest control guy, and I actually bought all the base. I think one was biffin and a few others, so I'll usually attack the ant family and a few others, and I'll use that as a topical spray, and those ones are quite strong. It takes like a month or two before rain will even wash them off. If I do that twice in a year, and then the fungicides, everything's cleared out, and you'll just see the tree kind of pumping really nice. Yes, sir.
Is there like a beetle or anything like that that messes with this, kind of like the sycamore? Like out
So actually, when we get to pest and disease, there's a few that they listed. So it's kind of weird, is most of them don't affect us here. Like they live, because they cover 22 states, so like they're actual things that predate on them. Looks large, but I've never seen them other than tip moth, and then even Japanese beetles just didn't walk anywhere near these guys. I don't know if it's just because the bark is so plated. When we had the giant cicada apocalypse, like they didn't get anywhere near them. I mean, they were attacking all my maples out front, but they did not seem to care one bit about these guys. Again, another nice thing about being an indigenous species, they have workarounds for surviving what normally predates on them, unlike, possibly some imported varieties. Let's see.
Did you say you start treating them with systemics immediately?
Like as soon as spring kicks off. Because, I usually collect in February through March, and as soon as they start growing, then I introduce it. Because if it's not really pumping water through it, it's not going to carry the systemic into the tissue, so I just don't really, the less I have to play with the nasty chemicals, the more I prefer, but once they start hydraulically moving a lot is when I start introducing that stuff. And that's also at the same cadence when the fertilization starts, coming in. I guess everyone had asked about deadwood characteristics. So they are a typical, I say typical, of the southern yellow pine family group as a lumber product. They have the typical two, like when you look at them from a cross section, like a disc cut, you'll see like typical pine, you'll see that kind of big white light layer, and there'll be kind of a dark layer, and that's what, you always see pine, it's got that kind of banding in it. The white layer is the early soft growth in the year, so it's what puts on at spring, and then the later one is the fall, which is the harder growth. These guys have a tendency of producing a lot more of the harder resinous growth. So if you have old, how that applies to these guys, as when you're dealing with a small old one that grew slowly, it will have a lot more of the hard resinous stuff. So if you have old gins on it, those actually hold. If you get one that grew real quick, like in a nursery environment, it's mostly that softer growth, and that'll just get punky and rot really fast. But some of the old deadwood that I've had on others, they seem to hold up quite, like, as good as most pine does. Aesthetically, it is a lot like a red pine. They do not do that kind of wild, flaky stuff that you'll see from like ponderosa pines or anything like that. It's not going to have that really gnarly look. It's a lot more elegant. It's a lot more long grain. It's very fine. It does not get that kind of alligatoring where there's like horizontal fracturing. That doesn't happen too much. It's just up the grain. So, which in a way I think looks quite nice because it contrasts nicely against, because the bark has got so much going on. It's so heavily fissured that having something a little smooth and a little elegant kind of helps kind of balance that out. But again, these guys also throw on callus so fast and they heal so quickly. A lot of that deadwood just gets enveloped by the tissue and wrapped back over. And you'll find that out when you go to bend a branch. You're like, man, this guy is like crazy stiff. And it's like, oh, because it's got a dead core in it somewhere. And that's from when it just healed itself back over. They are very flexible most of the time. But when you find one that's stiff, that's a good indicator that it had had a boo-boo at one point and then wrapped itself back over. So to the deadwood, I usually find they do better as like gin spikes and things like that. There's a couple that I've sold that had an interesting like stripe running up where it died off, and that's quite neat. And I'll show a photo of that later in the photo section, just to kind of give an idea. But again, it's not one of those that I would say is going to be a key feature of the tree. You're not going to design them around that. I've just not seen a lot of cool options. I do have a couple photos of mature ones out at the places that I collect at that have like a crazy big dead chunk running up the side of it that's like wildly elegant. But again, I just don't see it. It's not like when you see pondies where there's a profusion of them. It's not a feature of their environment. And I think it's just because of they have long growing seasons and they put on lots of vascular tissue, which is not how ponderosa pines operate. So most of that gets dealt with. I think also in our humid, wet environments, they evolved to close that stuff up so you would not get internal pith rot. Like that's another kind of like function of how it's trying to survive.
Did you mean to be sharing your presentation or not?
So it's not actually a presentation. I've got a PDF that you guys all get to take home if you want. That's just the notes from this. I'm using this to make sure I remember what I was asked to talk about. Yeah, and then, so pest and disease, the big ones that we deal with, we'll just go with pests first. You're gonna deal with cone worms, seed bugs, Texas leafcutter ant. Hopefully we don't have those here. You have weevil. Then there's this Nantucket pine titmoth. We have a local titmoth that fits the same thing, and they suck. Kill them as soon as you find them. I hate them. They're so gross. And then you have the red-headed pine sawfly, and then the southern pine beetle. But that one is definitely more towards like Georgia, Florida, down when you get into like real warm, humid environments. Doesn't really affect our area, but again, as we experience like shifts in the USDA zones and like different temperature bands or high humidity, you could have people migrating trees in and out from across the United States. It could be next this summer when someone introduces one of these little turds into our area, and now we're dealing with it. But those are the main ones that predate on them. Systemics work great on them. I've even seen a couple in the wild where it looks like a borer may have got to them, but that's again, systemics and topical treatments in the normal rotation work great. It is not, they're all very treatable. I recommend prevention before trying to deal with it after the fact. Inoculating is a much better approach dealing with them. And then disease, the only two that are really a big deal is root rot, which is not too common, but there's a particular strain, and I did list them in here, so if you guys want to do more research. And the other one was little leaf disease. So little leaf disease is not actually just a disease on its own, it's actually a complex. So it's usually, I think it's, the main one is Phytophthora will usually kick in, but it's caused by a weakness in the tree, usually from either excessive waterlog or also gross lack of nutrients. Those two things, and usually a lot of times the waterlog causes problems, which then they can't uptake nutrients, which then causes the Phytophthora to kick in. And so you'll start noticing like super, super tiny needles that are wilting at the top. And it usually is very evident in older trees. They're not putting on flushes, all the vigor disappears, and it's quite bad. Fortunately, in bonsai culture, it's terrible for the stands of trees, but in bonsai culture, a repot, a treating with inoculant and stuff like that, they're all treatable diseases. It's just being able to identify it. So those are the two main ones, is root rot and then little leaf disease. And there's whole papers on little leaf that people can look into if you want to know more. I don't collect trees that show any sign of that, and again, they're treated. So if they were carrying any of that pathogenic activity in, it's dealt with, but it's something to keep an eye out for. So we have covered morphology, and we covered distribution. Okay, so I guess what we'll do, I'll show a few photos of them when they were in the wild, and then we'll kind of move through it.
Is it showing up? What we might need to do is pop this button and now click the one that looks like the photo.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, so actually the tree that Bjorn showed at the U.S. Nationals, that's where that came from. He was asking about it, so I worked that up. Some examples of what some of the locations, I mean, you even see right here, here's a shortleaf popping right off, that's probably like 8 to 9 feet up. And then you got these little dudes growing here, and then every once in a while up here in these crags, you'll start finding the interesting ones, and then you can see right up top, bigger guys are growing right out of that.
Is that granite? Or?
That's sandstone, southern sandstone. These are not pines, but these were a couple of really cool junipers on one of the rock faces. I will probably be going after them next year. So here's what some of the environment looks like. It's, again, I usually go out when it's just rained or like calming down. I find it easier to collect. The only thing is when you're climbing and hanging off rock faces covered in lichen, that's a good way to find out gravity. So, but this is typically what this looks like. You'll notice down on the bottom below the hillside, it's a lot of deciduous down there. And then all across the hilltops, everywhere, is just nothing but shortleaf running all across the stand. That's all that is. Every once in a while, there'll be some loblollies intermixed in some of the stands. And then, so here's that one with the cool deadwood feature right here. Like when you see this guy when he's dried out, I use him as a landmarker. I usually check him out pretty frequently. This thing kind of spirals up and around, and it's even dead right there. And it's one of the ones I usually use as reference when I'm styling. Like anytime you're like, oh, I don't know if a branch bends that way, I'll go look. There's several of these that just absolutely twist around, and it's like, it's fun to go, okay, it doesn't have to just lay down and do this, this, or this. So I try to look at their adult analogs as something, but to give you an idea of what the environment looks like. That guy was one I had collected and sold. Right off this fog bank, that drops down like, I think it's about 100 feet. But I mean, it's like right after this, you can kind of see right here, just like, and they'll just grow right on the edges of these things. It's probably had a base like that big around, top about that wide, growing in like that much. Like they're pretty interesting. That was one of the ones that I sold up here. And that guy is like, as soon as you round that little lip, that's a big, big drop. And how that guy was growing, it's kind of hard to tell. This is a flake right here that comes across, and what it did was it actually grew all its roots underneath the flake. And so all I had to do is like kind of like lift the flake a little and then slide the whole tree out from under like it looked like a pinch credit card. It just comes out, wrap it up, and walk. And that guy was just kind of interesting because I was walking along at the end of the day and I was like, I hadn't seen much, and it was just sitting there looking like a bonsai all on its own, hanging out. This was another neat one. This guy developed in a funky little spot. It's a granite not a granite, it was a sandstone outcropping. It was like a big, kind of like the prow of a ship coming out. Probably like 40 feet projecting out into a valley. And on top of that, there was these 4 rocks that were just sitting on top. Like they had, like a big rock had hit and split at some point, and this guy just landed in between it as a seed. And enough duff and garbage had built up into it, it grew there. So when we pulled the 4 rocks apart, it was just like, pick the thing up. Because right below it is this hard rock. There was no taproot, there was nothing, it just pops right out. So you can imagine as soon as you put that in a box, it's like, ooh, and just takes off. So depending on where you collect in those environments, and making those choices of going, okay, is this gonna have a higher rate of survival? You can have pretty good work with them. But again, that's why I survey and hunt and take my time and mark and think about that. Yes, sir?
So you move these rocks?
Yeah, you slide them, and I mean,
How big was the rest of them?
I mean, the rock, probably each one was like 250 plus pounds or whatever. You just slide them and then you slide them right back. And actually, I grabbed a seedling and set it in there and put dirt around. It's like, maybe in another 80 years we'll have another cool guy here. But it was crazy because this huge rock projection, there's nothing there. It looked like a parking lot that's just left out there. There's this really great view. And this one tree is just hanging out, growing between some rocks, alone. And it's like, you just go walking through the tree line, you just see him sitting there picking up sun, and you're like, okay. Like, there's some neat, but again, I think I walked that day 15 miles before I found him. And it's just kind of one of those, like, to find cool stuff, you got to go to difficult places and then be patient. Like, it's not, like they said, don't fall in love with the first one you see unless it is amazing. Like, there are ones where you're like, yeah, that one's coming home. But that's your tree. So that was me standing probably 40 feet below it, looking up. I forgot what I was doing. I think I saw a bird, and all of a sudden I look up and oh, hey, neat tree. So that was my survey photo of yours. And that is the top view of the one that I showed you earlier where it had the marker saying 40 feet up. This is the one that Bjorn had in the show that I think now Brownlee Curry has and Tyler's been working on. Giving you an idea what that was. This guy was really cool. It was a little double trunk, like Shohin looking one, and he had died years ago. And so that's the other thing too. You come out here and there's these cool little gnarly dudes, and they've been dead for years, and you're just like, oh, had I been earlier. But that's kind of it does show like how rough the environments they are in. They are dying all the time. I mean, trees I've seen for years when I'm climbing, I'll come back the next spring and they're dead. Like they're kind of like your old friends, and then they're not there. And yeah, that was that. So I think that covers all the wild ones. Then we'll hop into some other stuff.
Have you done any post-mortems to the
Yes.
coverings and stuff?
Yep, I'll dig them up and take a look. So let's see.
How old are they?
So this guy was between, when I did the ring count on this one, it was between 100 and 150 years. The other old one from my first collection, which actually I'll show here.
You have to click that button and find the window. It should work.
Okay, there we go. That was this guy, right after collection. But yeah, the other one I collected on the same trip was right around 85 years old. Looks really old and gnarly, so it feels like once they break the 50-year mark, they have a lot of plates. Like it's really built up, and I've been checking all the bigger adult ones to kind of get an idea. They bark up quite fast, though. You'll even see on some of these smaller branches out on the end, they're already gray and forming like breakup bark on them, so they are just a species that barks rapidly. So the only way you're going to get a good count is taproot, and if you can access one. I had an older one that I found. It was one of my rescue ones. It had been hit by a road cutter, and it probably had a trunk like this big around. It's this big, gnarly, weird-looking thing. And I brought it back, and there was about no chance of it surviving. It did not survive, but as an interest, I decided to do a cross-section cut, and it was pushing around 200. So it was quite neat, but it would have been a very difficult bonsai to deal with. But again, one of the rescues. So that was this guy when it was first collected. And then what was interesting was this was like that day when it was collected. And again, when it was originally in the wild, it was growing out of a waterfall. So it was like this. Sorry, I'll pick that up later. And so all we saw was just this little top sticking out like this and this little kind of pigtail twist. And when we came down, we saw the bolus sticking out of, it was just kind of like a seam like this where the water would seasonally run through, and it had just stuffed a taproot went up the waterfall and found a little waco, like a hollow, where a little bit of duff had built up, and that was its entire root mass supporting it. And so when we first pulled it, there's that taproot that had come up, and then what I worked on it over the years with Bjorn, actually that's where it is now, but it got cut. When I first repotted it, I started doing that technique. I don't know if you've heard from when Bjorn will talk about when you have roots that are kind of unmanageable, but you can't lose them yet. You can take a saw, and in the spring when they're running good, put a little relief cut, not too deep, and you just keep doing that throughout the season, so it's slowly kind of killing that root back and forces it to grow back further, or you can do small wedge cuts. You do that continuously, and across like 2 years, it will blow out more roots locally around the base and start abandoning that, but you don't like abruptly cut that root off and potentially kill part of the tree. And that was what I did with this guy to get that cut back. And then this was actually within 3 weeks of that, this guy was certain he was going to die. I collected it, and then it dropped all its needles, like literally all of the needles. And I was like, well, it's dead. We're done. And then you can see on the ends, there's all these little buds starting to pop. That was the following week after that. It started pushing buds. What I've discovered with some of them is they will do this weird thing that when you collect them, they will, especially when their roots were heavily damaged in collection. This one lost a lot during collection. It didn't have much to start with. It will suck all the nutrition out of all of its needles, dump them, and then start another flush. Like as soon as the spring kicks on, it'll do that. That's why, again, now, this guy was collected in December. That's why I do recommend collecting later. It would be a lot less painful on the tree, and you don't kind of have this worry that you've just killed your tree. But they can bounce back from pretty rough conditions. The other big one, and I don't have him here because I was going to wire, that was the other one I collected on the same trip. That guy no longer has this branch. It's been fully cut off. All of that's been cut off on the end, and it's now a literati where it's got a branch running down here and a whole other pad out here. And that one, but again, those two were from the same collecting trip. And then this one was the one that Kaya styled when I first collected it. So this is one of those ones growing in the understory. And it's just a very simple little elegant tree. And then this is after Kaya styled it. And this guy's actually a really good example of that basal crook that I was talking about. You can see right here, there's that little hump. That was the one that it had when it started. And this was collected last February. This was when it was stabilized. And then this is November of last year when Kaya styled it. So they can cut as long as they're happy and you get the whole root ball. Because this guy was another one, the whole root ball came with it, so it worked really well. You can fast track their progression. It'll be great once this guy goes a couple more seasons and we can get those needles knocked down. Okay, and then this will just be kind of some, this is more for like shapes and variations, so you guys can get an idea of like the different kind of general, what you could see as a potential morphological representation of the plant, depending on where you collect. So this is just a really oddball, everyone's like, trees don't do 90-degree angles, ... And I was like, this guy was just this funky little oddball that we saw. It grew that way naturally. And so it's turning into some kind of weird penging / bunjin type thing where it's going to be different when it's done. There's Mike's. This was one of the ones I sold to Bjorn. This was again growing in an understory. It just was trying to sneak its way out to get the light. Again, you can tell where it had been broken down. There's a little gin stub. So it was probably running that way. Something happened, got mashed down, and then started having to go the other way.
Are those trunks bendable?
Yes. Bjorn did a pretty neat one. The very first tree I ever sold him was one I did not want to keep. It had a trunk about this big, and it was quite long. And he was like, I'm going to attempt a wedge cut on it. And I mean, in the, what was it? Yeah, early spring, he did a big wedge cut, like probably cut that much out of it, clamped it. It healed and didn't even miss a beat. And then we've done some pretty significant bends. So I think again with the callousing tissue and how fast the cambium operates, if you've got a good practitioner behind it and has good aftercare, there's a lot that could be done with it. And then this is another one of those examples of these kind of short, squat, fat ones that usually where I find them is in a really, really tight crack, something where there's just no place to go, and they just because pines like to store all their nutrition in their roots. Well, when there's not a place for roots to be, they start holding it in a bolus up in the upper part. At least with these guys. Out west, I think they'll call them kind of like is it kind of like a pinch? I forget the name of it. There's a phenomenon that you'll see with some of the trees where they're growing into a crack that's too tight and they just start swelling there because that's where all the nutrition's holding. These ones will do something similar, but I can usually also get roots with them. The ones out west are about impossible to extract because it's usually granite and it's just like you're not moving it. But you get neat shohin out of it. Like that's kind of the fun thing. There was another one. That one actually, my partner, he tripped over that. It was covered in pine needles. We had no idea what it was, and he about ate it, and he's like, I think we're like, oh, that's a tree, and I mean, like literally, we just picked it up. Like it was another one of these kind of funky ones, but you see how it's like pushing out fresh buds right out of old wood, and then also along here. Like as soon as you start getting them light and food, and they've got a good root mass, they're happy. Okay, so that's the end of those.
Have you done any work on grafting foliage?
Not yet. And that's mostly because we can get the needles so short that it's kind of been like I don't know why we do it.
I mean, grafting short leaf on something else.
So that we haven't done that yet. I mean, that would be an interesting. Some people have even talked about grafting like Japanese red pine onto them, or black pine, or other species where it's like if you like that and you want good understock that can survive our area. I've never done it. I'm just trying to figure out.
Shortleaf onto ponderosa.
That's what I was
Interesting,
thinking. Yeah.
Okay, and then this is kind of where you get into some deadwood. So that is a really old piece of deadwood on a tree that was, that's right at the base. And you can still see how much it's trying to callus. Like it's trying to push over. But that stuff was not particularly punky. Like, you could put your hand out, it was pretty tight. But any of the stuff up near the top that was like relatively newer growth, you'd stick your thumb out and just break apart, like, typical rotting timber. So when you get these older ones where a part had been there for years in its early development when it was rough, usually has enough resin in it, it'll hold. And then all you got to do if you really are concerned is just, especially if it's near where you're going to water a lot, treat it with typical wood hardener, stuff like that, and that'll be a way to keep that and allow it to dry out, get sun, things like that. But it has interesting character, but again, it's a lot more on the subtle side. Here's another one. This is very common. You'll see like just these openings where it's split, broken, it's starting to heal over. And it adds this kind of neat twist to the plant. You'll get a little bit of that spiraling that you see in ponderosas, just not as pronounced. You could, if you want, trace that out and open that wound up and actually expose more deadwood and actually create like a full like shari that runs down. That's also a possibility. Again, another close-up of that. Again, it's already starting to roll. Little gin stubs. And again, some of these gins are hard to see on these trees because the bark, once they age out and they get the same color, they look a lot like the bark. So there's that. And then I think these are just photos of, so there was a close-up of that one that that Kaya did, where you can see a very obvious basal crook. That is a lot of what you'll see on most of them, especially if you collect little guys. It'll have this huge basal crook, and it's just this tiny little twig sticking up. It seems like they invest a lot of energy in storing a bunch of nutrients right there near a bunch of buds in the event things go sideways. So they're little investors very early on. They're like, I think things are going to go sideways, so they're prepared for it. But that kind of concludes the general, I think those were the questions, correct? The ones that you wanted to address, and then I guess we can just open up to questions at this point.
Yeah, before that, about the basil crook, we're getting a bunch from the Missouri Department of Conservation next month that will be for sale, little seedlings to you guys. And you'll even see on those little 1 and 2 year old seedlings that they'll have the little crook in them, so you'll see it.
Yeah, the first time you see it, you're like, oh, I got a lucky one. This is kind of cool. It's got movement. You're like, oh, they all do this. And you're like, oh, and then you find out there's a reason for it, and it's actually like, and you'll see in hybrids, they'll even show them, they'll have what they call a non-functional crook. And so it'll be like half loblolly, half shortleaf, and it'll just be like this little slope instead of a full 90. And that's usually a pretty good indicator. I mean, and this is absolute hypothetical, like a guess, but I would imagine the ones that do not present a good basal crook probably may not be as vigorous and or prone to back bud, but that is purely guess. Because again, genetics are funky. You can see all sorts of different morphological expressions in plants, but that's something to consider. And also when you're identifying seedlings, which is very hard, that's a pretty big telltale if you see that is a short leaf. Because they'll look like a loblolly when they're little. If you're just looking at soil line up, you won't, it's hard to tell the difference. Anyone else have questions?
So your very general first year timeline after collection.
Yep.
Are you expecting to do any styling before fall? Do you start fertilizing right away when they start going?
As soon as they start, if I see candles starting to, like it's starting to move, that's immediately fertilization starts. And I keep that at a cadence of, I fertilize once a week, like hitting them with synthetics, like boom, boom, boom. Not because they're in pumice, it holds no nutritive value whatsoever. So I'm flushing it in and out frequently. If they have really put on crazy growth and they're insane, and I knew I didn't lose any roots in the collection, they go straight to styling that fall. Like if it was one where there was, it wasn't happy, then we're gonna hold that over. So again, it's just like every other bonsai, you know, it's like based on their, the better I get at it, where I collect them with more roots, I'm having less and less of them be weak going into the fall. So then so realistically, you collect in February, you're styling in fall, and then you're looking at a potential first repotting the following spring, which is a pretty fast cycle, really. I have not had to go 2 years before repot. Like, I don't have to. There's some I do just out of pure laziness. It's hard to catch up.
If you repot it, are you not candling it similar to other pines, or are you still candling it?
We've done both, and it
Okay.
didn't seem to care.
Okay.
It just did not seem, like, as long as it's showing strength. Like, I mean, it's like, I think that's kind of the root of them, is if they're showing vigor and strength, they don't care.
What about your first aggressive chop?
The first chop, if it's a big one, I mean, I probably want to wait till the following. So I would let them run all the way through the fall, get through that fall fertilization, do the whole winter with that entire foliar mass, and do the chop kind of like you do with deciduous, do it as they're waking up, so that way it can callus over and do whatever it needs to do. I'm always a little concerned about hacking off like a ton of foliar mass right before it goes into winter, where it loses its cold hardiness, because you don't have that foliar mass to be a nutrient buffer to the root system. So that would probably be where I'd caution if you're doing something massive like that. Treat it more like a red pine, like lean into the early spring, late winter for your cut. Yes, sir.
So you, after you collect and it wakes up, you use Miracle Grow every week, like the regular amount that you would use?
I buy a bulk pack of the blue stuff, like the granular, and then I just sit there and dose out 1 tablespoon for 2 gallons, and everyone gets watered with that. Like the recently collected, they are treated very different from plants in development. These are burn victims getting patched back together who need. You need to give them every opportunity to push. Building up a nice microbiome in the soil is just not going to happen, because they're not going to be in that container long enough for that to matter. Also, pumice is so inert, very little stuff. You're just not getting a lot of microbial activity. So the cation exchange is so low that it's kind of, all the benefits of organics are it's pearls before swine. You're wasting very good stuff on something that's not going to do it. Plus, I want a higher NPK value for getting that thing to push growth. Especially because of how it holds nothing in the soil. To be clear, I have never over fertilized one of those on those dosing. Like the more I give them, the more they're like, "Roo." And what I really want to do is I want them to produce enormous amounts of buds, elongate like crazy, because those needles don't matter. They are not the needles you're going to be married to. And so that way the goal is by fall we can get our first styling in. You know, that's usually how I am gauging how I want to get them prepped.
So you're keeping as much of the soil as you can.
Mm-hmm. The only thing I do that I guess is just like my particular thing is when it feels fairly compacted, I will actually take a chopstick before I pot with the pumice and I will go through and like just aerate the crap out of that root ball. I'll come through the bottom, the sides, everywhere, and I tease some stuff out. Kind of like if I find really dense stuff, I'll also go fishing for rocks. It never fails. There's like a rock like this big hidden in there. Fish all that out, re-aerate, and then as you go to push that pumice back in there, especially the finer pumice, you're kind of allowing a little bit of structure. So later on down the road, when the first true repotting happens, where I move them into like an Aoki blend or some type of 1-1-1, I then remove more of that field soil. I remove a little bit, and every time I repot, a little bit more of that core is removed, and a little bit more new bonsai soil is introduced. And so that way, as we fast forward like 5, 6, 7 repots, you're now nearly down to 10% of what the original field soil was, but you gradually taper it off. And there's some really old ones in Japan that still have field core in it, like that has never been removed, unless you have the whole sheen dye up through the bottom, and then they'll do a replacement. But it's just kind of, if the tree's happy and it doesn't seem to be affecting its health, it's kind of one of those, I'm just a little, especially when they're first collected, try to keep as much. Every time I've had one that has less field soil, it does much worse than the ones that have all of it, which is typically counter to how deciduous operates.
When you're pruning, how much of the kindle are you cutting back?
I treat it like a Japanese black pine, so we're back to stump. I've tried a couple of those ones where you leave like a 1/4 inch or do the fuse so it dies back. All it does is just blow out more on another side. Like it's just like the tree will just start running. I find if you just do a hard cut back everywhere, definitely select all the ones that are growing vertically and get rid of them as fast as possible because they do take off. Anything vertically oriented is going to be a headache in the future. I will say that. And again, just like any other pine, if there's kind of a weaker side, leave more needles. You know, just always be aware of that. Sometimes I'll just leave the candle. I won't even touch it. If it's a weak candle, it doesn't get touched. So.
David?
You talked about chops a minute ago. I've been collecting these for almost 3 years, and the two of them died on me. One of them last year in June, I chopped it pretty much. It was a big tree, and it had one giant branch on top, and I didn't want it. There was below, and I chopped it. And it was not growing.
What time of year?
It's dead yet, but it appears to be dead.
Yeah, you and I were talking about what time of year did that cut happen?
June, early June,
June.
probably too late.
Yeah, it probably would have been, just in my experience, I'd probably say, again, that February, March before it wakes up.
Yeah.
Because, again, you know, it's like they do the typical thing. They suck a bunch of nutrients out of their foliar mass, dump them in the roots to hold over spring. And then when it goes to retranslocate those back into tissue, if all of a sudden it's missing its head, it's like, well, these buds are getting the energy, not the top. It hadn't even gone through its fall cycle of the second vascular tissue run and also the translocation of sugars. So it's probably why it didn't have a good time. I would say it's more of a timing thing, not a technique.
I just noticed that every other one when I did anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, and you know, like with the younger ones too, they just have like bananas vigor. Like it, you can just stomp on them and throw gasoline, and they'll just be like, all right, I'm back. But it's funny. As soon as they get a certain diameter, they gotta be a little bit more delicate with them. But I'm thinking timing wise, just because the mass of that cut. I also, just as a general practice, I know people have opinions, but like I will usually use a callousing cut paste on these guys for stuff I want to heal over. I kind of treat it like, my wife's a microbiologist and she's always like, yeah, of the attitude. I mean, do you leave an open wound for pathogens to get in, or do you close it up? And if I have the opportunity, especially with collected trees, you know, when they first come in, I am going to, every time I do major cuts, everything gets sealed up. So I don't make it more difficult on that plant because they don't have an active immune system. They have a passive immune system. So it's like they can't just marshal energy to deal with something that's going on. So there could be a myriad of things, but I would say my guess is that it just, not enough hormones and sugars and starches have been translocated down from the foliar mass in the lead up, and that's probably what caused its inability to have the energy to marshal a second push after that.
I mean, it had been potted up for a year and a half.
Yeah. Do you still have it?
I do still have it, I haven't taken it out of the pot, I'm still hoping it's gonna come back.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm gonna hold out hope on that one. Just it could,
Also, one more thing, if you ever collected them at these little, or out on the extended branches, they have little balls with holes in them, and some people look like Russian, something, you know what that is?
I do not know. I'm not sure what that is, but there is that's I guess one other thing. I've found gall on them. You'll see like a big nasty gall growing out in the middle of a branch, and yeah, there'll be like a black ball with some type of worm. I'm not sure what that is, but when I'm in the field, those get cut right off.
Yeah.
I don't even take that home with me. I don't want any of that noise in my garden. So
I'm curious if it was down there. or something.
I've seen quite a bit of it. So I mean,
Like
it,
on private property, and I don't know what else they have there.
yeah, yeah, I've seen quite a bit of it. Anyone else?
What do you do for bud selection when you get those 10,000 buds, the top harvest?
I usually let them swell all the way, and then I don't touch them until again like late winter, early spring, because I kind of want to see. I always feel like so much can go wrong across the winter. Like some things just don't make it. The tree decides to make decisions, and I'm there. I kind of make all those decisions right about that time, unless I'm getting insane thickening that I have to.
You said early winter.
Huh?
You do that in the winter, early winter time?
Usually, late winter, early spring. So, and that's, again, I do most of that because right before it wakes up, I go, okay, don't waste energy on this, 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 or this, and I'll just break those off. And I usually select, and I mean, it's typically your normal selecting to bifurcating pairs, or I go with the one that's oriented in the direction I like the most that requires the least amount of effort later for wiring. So sometimes when they produce 5 of them, if you want a downward oriented branch, it'll have a bud jammed down on the bottom. I'll break all the top ones off and leave that guy to be the leader because the shoulder of that joint will come down and like nicely lay down, and I don't have to do a hard bend when I go to deal with it later. So it's kind of the standard practice that you'd use on most pines, like nothing too wild.
Any other questions?
You said you cut off a few things at collection that you really don't want to take home. Do you do any other removing foliage or just stuff that could be harmful to your?
Stuff that'll be harmful and things that one will not fit the vehicle, or that's like a whole side later that you would cut off for the design. I will drop it. Also, if I feel like if I had to leave some roots behind, and I'm looking at the root mass to the foliar mass, I'm like, this is way out of balance, and I will make executive decisions like I would never use this chunk in the design. That's coming off, and that way I'm not taxing the already damaged root system more than it needs to, based on the foliar mass.
As long as you feel the root foliage balance
Yep.
is still there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Where's the basal bend in relation to the ground? I mean, does it vary or like?
I mean, with anything like growing in the wild, there's going to be variance, but usually you see it like you'll have your fine feeder roots, taproot comes down, and then kind of right about, so you'll have the fan of those roots, it'll come up and make this bend like this, and the soil line's right here, so it just turns and goes with it, and then the leader comes up.
Okay, so
And
it'd normally be above ground then.
Usually just below it. I mean, you'll see it depending on the erosion nature of that area. If it's on a slope or something like that, it can vary, but that's usually how it goes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I got something about Bursera, because
Yes.
I think you're the only person I've ever seen that knows anything about it. So Bursera, they get that big like the big bump in the middle, right?
Yeah, the caudex.
Yeah, the caudex. Well, with like adeniums or like Portulacaria, you can chop and like replant, right?
Mhm.
Does that work the same way with Bursera? Or?
I would do that in Mexico. I don't know if I'd do it here.
Yeah.
So I have my neighbors who live across the street are from Mexico, and they actually take Bursera, cut them like that, and they wait till the rain season. They dig a trench in their yard. They plant a bunch of them like that, and they fuse together, and that's how they make fences.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
Wow.
they call them living fences, and they just do that to mark off their property.
Huh.
And I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, you just take a machete, chop, stick. And I'm like, okay. And I was like, yeah, you clearly have the climate for that. I would just have a dead plant. But yeah, this is very normal. All the way through Brazil, where their natural range is, they do that all the time.
Okay, cool.
I don't think we have a long enough, hot enough growing season. But yes, yeah, that is very possible.
Yeah, I was just wondering about that because I get that big bump there, and I've got like lights and stuff, so I don't know, maybe I'll try it.
Try it. Yeah, let us know.
Yeah.
Some point down the road, I'll do a speech on that one. Like,
Have you ever put any back in, like brought some home, put them back in the ground if they're struggling, or tried to grow any, like in a field growing operation?
not yet. I would like to later do, because like collecting is only going to go on for so long. Like there is a hard limit to where really cool ones are going to be collectible, and then we're just kind of scraping the barrel. And I feel like, just like what the Japanese did, we need to start coming up with good cultivation methods at home to start building quality shohin and things like that, and then building out other projects from that, and also selecting for great foliar qualities and things like that. So I would like to get into getting more seedlings and doing like lots of them to see what, start doing some A/B testing and figuring things out. Because like in the wild, I cannot control for any of that. And again, there is a point. There's only so many cool ones in the wild that are capable to be collected, and then it gets to an ethics thing. And at a certain point, we do need to start building a market below that that will support those coming up. So that that is a longer term goal, because at a certain point, dangling from rocks is not going to be physically a thing I'll be able to do. And there are only so many rocks that have cool trees. So it just is what it is. But no, not yet. The future plans.
I have some in mind.
Yeah.
If you have any tips.
Yeah. I do not. I would look to any of the YouTube channels of those Japanese families that grow tons and tons of pine in the ground.
Yeah.
That's going to be the closest thing that would have any useful information on that.
Tim just posted a bunch of photos of
Yeah,
ground
so,
growing
I mean, I am trying to do it.
pines in Japan, so.
Yeah, they've got it figured out.
We'll have to pick his brain when he gets back about what he saw in Takamatsu or whatever they're doing. So there's no further questions. I'm sure Kurt will be around the meeting afterwards. Christian, do we have any raffle items today?
Yeah, a few.
Okay, there's a few items in the raffle. Go see Christian if you want to participate in that. Ethan brought in a hornbeam that he collected. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, how I handled the roots up here. And then if you have dues to pay, see Rosemary in the back. Yeah, Ethan.
I've got a whole bunch of bonsai seeds if anybody wants them for free.
And if you want any free bonsai seeds, check them out over there. We need them. All right, thank you all for coming. We hope to see you all in a couple weeks.
Thank you.